We have a good critical mass. I expect more people to trickle in. We are getting closer to the edgier part of the program where we try to add it all together. This, interestingly enough, when Brad did his thing at the beginning, we did not have a lot of people here know wireless spectrum. So those who don't know this world, you're in for a treat. Just to set the background just a little bit.
Don't buy it.
Oh, come on, buy every minute of it. In 1934, actually before that, 1927, Congress passed the Radio Act, and in 34, the Communications Act, which adopted the basic regime, and it declared that the public owned all wireless spectrum, and it was a public trust. Sound a little familiar to some water people here? But it could be licensed to others with a right to use. And that was done based on a public interest standard. And so the FCC engaged in what has been often called command and control regulation. It literally specified who was allowed to own it and for what particular use. And thus, if a farm bureau wanted to do a radio system, it would have to say, I want to use this for farming. And if someone wanted to use it for a dispatch system for taxi cabs, use it for taxi cabs. And so the FCC weighed what use was more valuable than others and was very prescriptive in how the wireless spectrum could be used. And literally until the early 2000s, if you had a license to use spectrum, it was only for you, and it could not be transferred to anybody else without the approval of the Federal Communications Commission, which would determine that the new acquiree was a worthy licensee. And that, of course, created what Ray Gifford has probably already used the word rent-seeking pressures.
I have not said rent-seeking or sheltering.
All right, so Ray, we'll need to let you interject more into this panel next, because literally Thomas Hazlitt wrote an article called The Wireless Craze. It was a whole history of wireless regulation where he referred to it as an invitation for rent-seeking, because anytime you put a federal body in between one use and another, what happens? People who don't want the use to be liberalized will oppose it because it may threaten their rents, and those who want a particular entitlement are looking to have their rents. And so the system was criticized, and one of the great things Dale Hatfield did at the FCC when he was there the last time was push for the first time, a secondary markets regime, which said you don't have to go to the FCC to get permission to allow a secondary use. And that frames up this conversation, which all pivots off of that important order. It begs a pretty basic question. The order was started, Dale, when you were there around 2000, but it didn't actually happen until 2003, right? As part of the Michael Powell Spectrum Policy Task Force. Well, let's take that as directionally right, which means we had a decade of this regime in place. I'm not going to introduce our panelists. They're all core in the Silicon Flatirons universe, although I think, Bob, this may be the first time you're participating, so it's great to have you here. Bob and Dale go way back in the world of spectrum. And I will start with Coleman, who literally, when I asked Pierre DeVries, who couldn't be here today, has another conflict, he's a Silicon Flatiron spectrum guy, who is the best economist we can get to talk about spectrum? He mentioned you, particularly in the context of spectrum markets. So how much activity have we seen, and is it as much as we might have expected, and what do we draw from that?
Thanks, Bill. So before I answer that,
Sure.
two other things. One about the political economy. One thing that energy and spectrum does have in common is bar associations. So anytime you have your own regulator or your own sub-bar
Water
association.
has it too, by the way.
If
If you're in Colorado, how many members of the Colorado Water Bar?
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
It's a trifecta. And that's why we're here talking about it, probably, as resources. The other thing is the connection, the further connection about my history with spectrum is my dissertation at Berkeley Ag's econ department was on California water policy, and the Congressional Budget Office hired me to work on radio spectrum management. And 6 months later, I realized why, and it's because of the similarity of these economic goods, as I mentioned, publicly owned by the government with private use rights, that trade, even before the secondary markets proceeding, ownership of the right could trade fairly well, but how the right was used could not. So in
Well,
California,
fairly well is a relative matter. You had to get the FCC to approve it, which often meant a 6-month process.
yes, but even by the late 90s, something like 85% of TV broadcast licenses had changed hands since they were issued. So you could get an efficient television broadcaster. You can get an efficient farmer using their water. But what you couldn't do is have a farmer sell his water to a city or have a TV broadcaster sell their radio spectrum to a cell phone company. And that's the real failing of this market. So to take, I feel kind of funny as an economist raising this question, but to take a little issue with the title of this seminar. As an economist, I have to be pro-market or I lose my membership in the club. But I do want to step back and ask why markets in spectrum, why markets in any of these goods? And the problem that we face is that we have valuable, scarce, limited natural resources or resources that are having trouble getting from low value to high valued uses. And so that's the problem we're trying to solve. How do you get radio spectrum from a use like taxi cab dispatch to cell phones or from broadcasting to cell phones? Or how do you get water out of agriculture and into an urban use? And that's the reason for the market. So when we talk about markets in radio spectrum, I want to always be mindful of the problem we're trying to solve, and it's not just making markets just for the fun of it.
Come on, markets are fun.
Markets are fun.
Secondary markets are a particular kind of fun. Yes. Why aren't we having
kinky fun?
There you go. So why aren't we having more fun in this area? There was a lot of promise that we would be seeing market transactions, and how much of that promise is actually happening?
So I think the fundamental reason why we haven't is because there was nothing in the secondary markets order that allowed a licensee to change how they were using their spectrum. So although it encouraged changing the ownership of the license without a whole lot of approval, and it even went so far as to say you can slice and dice your license into partition it or carve off some megahertz. It still doesn't allow you to change how you use it, and that's the central problem that we face. So the firms or the reason we haven't had a market develop, I believe, is because there is no pull of demand. There's not enough pull of demand just for the change in ownership within the quarantine use that we have. Analogies are often made to land, and I think they're not bad when it comes to spectrum. Land changes ownership fairly well, but zoning is the issue that is the analogous issue we're dealing with here, and that's not to be confused with all uses. I like to say that I'm staying at the Millennium Hotel while I'm here. They are not leasing me title to the land that I'm sleeping on. They are just renting me a room. And in that sense, spectrum is well shared. The cell phone networks we use are some of the most intensively shared spectrum out there. It's just the ownership isn't what's shared. And so that may be a feature of the wireless market, that it doesn't need quite as much slicing and dicing as other markets might.
All right, when I asked Dale, you can see I asked Dale a lot of questions. I said, Dale, what lawyer in private practice has done some of these secondary market transactions? He said, oh, you need to ask Michele. So I take it Dale has reason to believe you know this world and have been in it. How much activity have you seen, and what kind of activity has it been?
Thank you, Phil. First of all, it's great to be here and to come back to Silicon Valley. And it is true, I have done quite a few spectrum leases. I would say well over 100, even at the early period of time when not many were going on. So we had to really construct from scratch some of the initial leases. So on the one hand, I've seen some success, but on the other hand, I've seen a lot of sadness and disappointment by people like myself who were really excited about this realm and a new way to get more spectrum out to the market and into the hands of people who want to use it. But it hasn't quite maybe done as well as people might have hoped or expected. What we tend to see it used more for, and I did a little survey last week. I was at the Competitive Carriers Association, and I talked to all the carriers I saw, plus other spectrum users and equipment providers, and they all gave pretty much the same answers. So I ranked them as to how it's typically being used. Mostly it's being used for transactions. So if a company is buying or selling spectrum to each other, it's an easier way to facilitate the transaction going faster and more smoothly if you include a spectrum lease.
It avoids the FCC process that I referred to earlier, for example.
Or makes it go, you can leapfrog it to an extent by doing a spectrum lease, and that way you don't have to wait as long for the FCC approval, which could take anywhere from 2 months to 6 months or longer, depending. You could do a lease in the meantime and kind of jumpstart. So that is probably the most typical use that I heard, especially among this tier of users, and frankly, that's probably most of the spectrum leases I've done have been in that context. Second is what we're referred to as economic adjustments or rationalizations along border areas. So especially in the cellular days and often in PCS, people picked up funky little bits and pieces that didn't line up well, and so it helps companies better align their spectrum holdings by doing spectrum leases. So that makes perfect sense. The next area is fill-in, so that's similar to the other. So you have a part of an area, but you're missing a key piece, and you can't seem to buy it from the holder, then you can maybe sometimes work out a lease. And the last area is to meet build-out deadlines, where you're just not sure, and it's some of the really rural carriers said this, they really weren't sure how to use it, or they thought they might, but not for quite a few years, or they weren't going to use X piece of it that they bought. So they could lease it usually to a utility or a one-off user. It usually was not going to be for consumer purposes. So those tend to be the most typical uses. In addition, I have actually done a lot of leases for what I will call non-wireless industry spectrum users who are using it for vertical purposes. So I'm doing a lot of leases right now for the railroads who have to meet a federal mandate for positive train control. And they don't typically buy spectrum, but they had to buy some spectrum here. Commuter rails don't really have money to go out and buy spectrum, and they don't necessarily need as much. So a few freight railroads went out, bought spectrum, and now we're doing a lot of leases for them. So that's one set of leases. I did a number of leases for the Public Safety Spectrum Trust.
Let's come back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. So that's public safety.
Own topic, yep.
And then I've helped different parties lease spectrum from Access Spectrum, which was a sort of a leasing agent set up by the FCC, guard band lessor. And there are not that many parties that have been interested, but they tend to be utilities or other companies that might need spectrum for monitoring purposes, for example. So I'll stop there, but I also can tell you down the road some of the problems and complaints I hear about why people haven't done as much leasing.
So Bob, you were nodding at the utilities one. Is that an area you've seen, and where have you seen this come up?
Well, I've seen it come up in a couple of different contexts, and I think, first, let me just start with an ugly secret, and that is, even though the order was adopted in 2003, it was really an adjustment to a lot of things that were already going on in the industry. And I actually remember talking with Dale, well, he was at the FCC, not all this, but before we had leases, we had management agreements. And we had a lot of clever, smart lawyering and practices in that. And so some of this we've seen.
We're all for smart and clever lawyering here.
Yeah,
so.
and not enough of it, I might add.
Amen.
You know, the context of spectrum leases that we've dealt with, I mean, I think Michele gave a very excellent overview of what's going on. I mean, you know, we've heard of it perhaps being used as an early entry for in rural areas to help carriers with build out, and from that perspective, providing some people a business opportunity they might not have otherwise. I know that there's some plans for more aggressive leasing that are at least on the drawing board with respect to some spectrum that may be coming online. For example, some of the satellite spectrum, the terrestrial use of that, you know, there's a lot of different business models. The access spectrum model is one we're familiar with. I actually sold access spectrum, the spectrum that I think they've now given to the railroads.
That's right.
You know, I personally think spectrum leasing has been a relative success. I would expect it to be employed more in the future than it has been already, and I think it's a good tool for carriers and even small businesses to get access to spectrum.
All right, before I come back to you and Michele, some more details So, Charla, you have the benefit of being in a company that actually has to think about this and has done some of this. So,
Yep.
how much have you seen this as an opportunity, and how has it been most actively used?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because when the commission actually was looking at these rules, I was actually very actively engaged in the proceeding. And what I told them over and over again was that I don't know how others are going to use this, but I can tell you that we will use it exactly the way Michele described, is primarily to ease from in transactions, because fairly frequently, somebody needs access to the spectrum, fairly quickly, so you want to actually give them, it's part of the negotiation of a transaction. And it's turned out to, for us, for a long time, that was exactly the way we used it. And what's interesting is about 2-3 years ago, we actually, when we bought 700 megahertz spectrum, which was the first time that we actually purchased spectrum that covered the entire United States. We actually, people don't realize that, but until we purchased that spectrum, we actually still had holes in our footprint. And what we wanted to do, and it actually was our then CTO, who's since retired, and our CEO of Verizon Wireless, who's now CEO of the big company, just said, look, let's look at a way that we can try and figure out how to reach, a little bit further into rural America than we do now. And the way to do that was we actually lease spectrum to, for the most part, it's rural carriers, but we do have some, lessees that are actually, not the traditional rural carriers. And what they wanted to do, and it's actually part of a deal we do with them. We launched our fourth generation LTE, which requires that you have to purchase equipment that's fairly expensive, and it's sort of in the place of a switch. They call it the core. And if you're a rural carrier looking at launching 4G and you have to actually put that kind of money into the whole system, it just didn't make any sense. So there was this really nice kind of relationship between us and some of these rural carriers who definitely wanted to launch next generation services. So what they did is they did what is a very long-term lease. These are 20-year leases. They actually are longer than the lifetime of the actual license that we have.
Is that legal to do that?
It is. I'm not a lawyer, so I will not answer that.
Bob,
but,
can you lease an asset for longer than you
well,
own it?
our lawyers seem to think it's written. The language is written in such a way that it accommodates it if the FCC.
If you
If
can,
the
if you
FCC
get
right,
it,
yeah. Sorry,
yes.
but I just wanted to make clear that these are not 4 or 5 year leases.
Right.
These are leases where the expectation is that these guys will go off and they'll have it for some period of time that would be fairly lengthy, and that they can really build a business on it. They build their radio access network, and they actually then roam on our network, we roam on their network. And what was interesting is it started out as an idea that we thought might work, and it's turned out to be, for us, to be a significant way that we look at actually expanding our
and do
our
they
network
market
coverage.
it as Verizon Wireless, or they market as their own name?
They are themselves. They're
I
the
see.
companies. They're not an affiliate of ours. They literally, the agreement is it's a network agreement.
So let me go back to Coleman, who said a distinction that for many of us we're not quite sure what he meant. He said there's spectrum lease and there's like rent. And I'm assuming, based on what you said, maybe the rent is like what we might call in this wireless world a mobile virtual network operator. And my question to you is, what Charla's describing more like an MVNO? Is it
MVNO.
MVNO, a mobile virtual network operator renting a hotel room, or is it more like you get the whole lease?
The rural build-out is more like leasing the property, so it's more like a store owner taking the title to their land as opposed to renting in a shopping mall that somebody else builds.
So if Verizon had still the spectrum there and was operating a network, but let some people like sell on the operated network and spectrum it owned, that would be more like an MVNO?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And and it depends on the problem you're trying to fix. So in rural America, it's a build-out, it's an infrastructure problem of getting infrastructure built in the first place. So they're partnering with people with local expertise and can market and sell there create a complementary asset, as opposed to another service operator in the national market might just need capacity to offer
And
something like.
some of these operators already have networks in
Yeah.
place, so they may have towers.
Yeah,
and
they may have
infrastructure.
tower facility. In fact, that's what I was saying
It's more
earlier, that
typical.
most of it's more typical, but we actually do have agreements with some who don't have the radio, the ability to just throw up a radio access network. I did want to add something, though, that, you were asking me about, our specific, look at these rules, but one thing that I think doesn't come out in these discussions, and I don't know whether both of you agree with me, but these rules are actually fairly complicated. And, when they first came out with the rules, I was astounded by, the size of the orders and what you had to go through in terms of actually being able to do it. So it's, and Spectrum Bridge, I think, has even mentioned this publicly, and in actually, frankly, their marketing materials. Spectrum Bridge is a company that seeks to act as a go-between between holders of spectrum and potential users of spectrum. And one of their marketing angles is that it's very complicated for you to go out and get your own lawyer. Sorry, no offense, but since I'm not a lawyer, but I may be, I'm worried that my FCBA non-attorney membership might be revoked. But I think that actually is a huge issue here, and some of that stems back to a fundamental issue of the law. And I'd be very interested in the two lawyers on the panels to talk about 310D, because even though, as you said, Phil, that the commission actually was, allowed this sort of free transfer, all of the rules go to making sure that they are, in complete compliance with the law. So
All right, so I want to get to the lawyerly question, which is a good one. Before we get to the lawyerly question, Coleman, I might need to ask you this. When Verizon came and told me what they're doing, I was very excited. I was actually working in the White House, and I think you came and briefed me on this.
talked about it.
I've been wondering, why aren't more companies doing this? So what's the explanation for why Verizon has made this aggressive pitch to say, we're not going to use our spectrum in rural parts, let other people have at it and lease it? From a resource management, that's like goodness.
Can I clarify one thing, just
Yeah.
to make sure? We actually really do reach a lot of rural America. It's just that sort of the last 5%. So,
that's
I mean, it's...
very important. It's the last 5%, which is a lot of ground.
Which is a
for
lot
those
of
who
ground.
live in square
A
states.
lot of ground,
So,
yeah.
yes. So,
Back when the PCS spectrum came out in the mid-90s, Sprint bought a lot of radio spectrum, and they faced having the problem of having to build out a network, because spectrum without complementary capital is not very useful, and it takes a lot of capital to turn into a productive asset. And they faced building out a lot of their licenses to the nation, and they were constrained by capital and management resources and planning and whatnot, and developed a number of relationships with other companies that would build out their network and sell it under the Sprint brand name. And this was because they needed help in actually deploying capital and managing it. Years later, all of those companies got bought up by Sprint and were brought in under, because once the capital was built, it was less important.
it's worse than that. When Sprint tried to merge with Nextel,
This
some of
was
those
what
companies
triggered
said, in our agreement, it says you can't do this to us because Nextel had overlapping areas and it would have constituted competing with these folks,
Yep.
which
That
was
was
not
very
allowed
true.
under the agreement.
That's what started the lawsuits that all settled in bringing the equity into under one ownership. So there was an example of, there was a reason to transact across a market instead of internal to the company, going back to Coase's theory of the firm. And then the reason changed, and they brought it all within the scope of the company. The question here is, now Verizon has built out, and now we're on a different margin, and why are they reaching across the boundary to another company instead of doing it internally? And I think it's because of, not that Verizon doesn't have capital or expertise about building networks, but because it's very expensive to build in rural areas, very difficult, and they're partnering with companies that already own some capital that's being deployed there. So the incremental cost of the capital to deploy there is much lower, and it's not efficient to hive that off. Instead of renting towers, they just let the company put out the
No,
network.
I think it's a great explanation you just gave, and you didn't actually answer the question.
You're
Why
welcome.
aren't other companies doing what Verizon's doing? And, it strikes me as a smart use of this ability. A more cynical explanation, Charla, which you can push back on, is the reason you're doing it is because the FCC had particularly aggressive build-out requirements in those 700 megahertz rules, and you were forced to look at the use it or lose it consequence for not building out. And I assume you'd say that's not.
No. I mean, it's actually their population builds that we
So you're not
have
gonna
no
get to.
trouble. I mean, we can use their build to meet our build out, but that really
was not
had no
desirable.
impact.
Okay.
So other companies probably don't, I don't think they have as much rural unused spectrum, because they don't have that national footprint,
Okay.
would be one reason.
Probably not true for AT&T, who has the same
Probably not
700
true for
megahertz
Sprint.
build out. Yeah.
But they don't have the.
So for students here, this is a very good paper topic, and you should talk to people afterwards. Why is Verizon using one particular aggressive form in rural areas, which is promising, and Verizon's now saying it's working well for you guys,
Well, and they're launching too.
and they're
These
actually
guys,
launching,
they're
it's really
launching.
happening.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, no other company has yet done that in rural areas.
That's,
Another aspect of this is, and I think the question is why isn't AT&T doing it, but why others don't do it could be because as a national carrier, the importance of saying we are everywhere
Yep.
is different, and T-Mobile doesn't compete as aggressively in that area, and obviously the smaller carriers don't, but the other two big ones still have the value of the
Okay, so
national
it still
footprint.
begs the question, to the extent AT&T or Sprint have national spectrum holdings, and they know they're not going to use it in rural areas, from a public policy perspective, you'd want to see someone else get access to the resource who would use it.
Yep.
From an economic, self-interested business standpoint, they would say, I'm not going to use it, let someone else use it, and I'll get some money from it. It's a little bit of a both public policy and business conundrum issue why that's not happening. Michelle, do you have an idea?
I asked the carriers that when I was at this convention, and, sorry?
Let's say ROI.
Yeah, but if I'm a company and I say, I'll let you lease the spectrum for $1 a year, and I know I'll never use it, I'm making more money. Unless you think the transaction costs are too high to justify the deal, right? If the
Well, to build it, yeah, it's upfront.
No. The scenario is as follows. I have this spectrum in rural areas that I am never going to use. I could say to the world, hey, anyone who wants to lease it and pick whatever metric you want to lease it for, have at it, because I'm not going to. Whatever money I get's gravy. Now, the money could be too small to be worth it, or the transaction cost could be too high to justify it, but assuming those two are not the case, why doesn't this happen?
The third one is there may not be this pent-up demand for rural carriers to be spending all this money building out networks beyond what they have.
Well, so one answer is
Which
this
is
can only
the
happen
phenomenon.
one time, and Verizon already got there first.
We're
No one
not
else will ever
everywhere.
do it. That's an answer. I would think that, someone could compete with Verizon and say, I'll give a better offer, build out in this network using my spectrum on my offer. So it's,
Although Charlotte probably can't answer the question, but I would imagine there's not actually a lot of money that transfers in these leases, that the value really is the extension of Verizon being able to roam into their networks, and their interest is it having access to the Verizon network.
But the real issue that they have also told me is that they are not in the leasing business. And that is a separate market, a type of activity, and it really does have its own set of transaction costs that they don't want to take on. And not only that, they don't necessarily want to encumber their spectrum, even in the more rural areas, until they're sure what they want to do there.
so I think that's actually the option value theory, if you will,
I think that's-
that someday, somehow, I might figure out what I want to do with it, and
And in the
until then, I don't
meantime-
want to encumber it at all.
Right, and so some might go to them and say, well, what about a 2-year lease or a 3-year? And there are different models that the FCC has. There's a spectrum manager lease where the spectrum lessor has greater control, and you could do that either on a short-term or long-term basis. And there's also a de facto transfer control type of lease, either short-term or long-term, and there the lessee has greater control. So the FCC has set up several different types of models, but it appears that none of the models seem to suit, and frankly, either party, because I talked to potential lessees and people that were part of the Verizon program, and they had their own set of complaints on the other side, why they would never do it again, why this was the one time they would do it for this reason, et cetera. And others were not going to enter those leases with Verizon because they were concerned about the different elements of it. One was the length of time, the 20 years was viewed as too long. They viewed it as expensive. They didn't like many of the conditions. And they also felt like they were taking on a lot of risk because they don't own the spectrum. And but for the fact that many of them already had their own infrastructure or the like, they said that, gee, we weren't sure we would do this but for X, Y, and Z at the time. Now, you know, that may just be talk, but on the other hand, there were concerns.
So one question that Coleman raises for Charla is the expertise transaction cost. You could have gone to Spectrum Bridge and say, act as an intermediary. We don't do this brokering of spectrum. You didn't do that. You are doing
But
this.
it's not, but that wasn't what it was. It wasn't brokering of spectrum because we were actually looking for a way to extend, you know, through these partners our footprint in part, even though they're the ones that actually have, you know, that it's their branding, it's not us. But it's and it's also, I mean, it's a fairly, you know, complex relationship back into the core of the network as well. It's not, you know, it's not just spectrum leasing. You know, I'm not sure whether we would ever do that. And I didn't realize that this was going to be a panel about our
Verizon.
LTE Rural
The
America
other
program,
thing
or I would have been.
that's just worth saying about this, not that this isn't an important issue, but we are talking about the tail of the distribution of coverage
Yes.
by a certain technology of mobile wireless, the vast majority of it. And so, and it's a high-cost area where you have a policy objective to make sure that rural areas are served,
Yep.
and it's not obvious why you would think a market's going to solve that in the first place.
So Bob, let me go to the big legal question that has been raised. 310D, which I think is something on the order of the public owns the spectrum, and the FCC has to oversee it. There's an argument out there that all these spectrum leases authorized under the Secondary Markets Order are illegal under the Communications Act. If memory serves, Dale, Commissioner Copps may have dissented making that argument. I don't believe that order was challenged in the DC Circuit, so there is not an authoritative ruling that basically blesses this whole regime. How worried should we be that at some point someone says, under the statute, this whole animal is really not tolerable?
I'm not particularly worried about that. I mean, you've got,
That was the question you were asking, Coleman, in a way, right? Okay.
yeah, I mean, you've got an order that's been out there for 10 years. You've got, I mean, it wasn't challenged. It's been, you know, in practice for a decade. You've got instances where licensees have relied upon it. I mean, you know, maybe you can frame the legal argument that, gee, you know, this is contrary to the Section 310D, but really, I just don't, it doesn't raise a flag for me.
So I think that answer would be, we're all legal realists now, seeing we're in a law school.
Well, you know,
Right,
maybe
and
I don't know
it's gonna
about you,
take-
but
It's going to take quite a amount of chutzpah on the part of any judge to invalidate a regime that has this much reliance interest built up on it.
well, I'm sure there are judges that would do it, but I'm also wondering who would bring the case.
Which relates to another aspect about markets and secondary markets and spectrum, which is, as every, I think, first year, I'm not a lawyer, so out on a limb here, but I think every first year law student knows a right is something that's enforced by a court. And the question in spectrum, in the world of spectrum, is if two parties have a lease, or if there's some even easier way of trading spectrum, and something goes wrong, you have the political system of the FCC to adjudicate it, and that's a disaster, as we could list many examples of problems being solved or not being solved there. And so until there's a forum to adjudicate disputes, what's being traded, what reliance, as you say, you can put on it, I think is an issue that's going to stop those markets from developing.
To answer Bob's question about how it has come up, it would come up one of the railroad leases with some original owner. The railroad would say, I'm not paying you any more money because I don't want to. And then the original owner licensee would sue and say, no, you owe me money. And a defense that could be interposed is, no, the underlying lease is void ab initio because it's against the law, right? So I had a fun time explaining this to my daughter, who I just read a book to. You can't enforce an illegal contract. Exactly. I'm a law professor, come on.
What book?
The book, by the way, for those, The Natural is the book, by the way.
Oh.
And it was, obviously, I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but there's the issue comes up, and my daughter was wondering about it, and I said, well, a court would never enforce an illegal promise, or a contract that was against the law. And this contract could be said in such a speech to be against the law. I don't think it will ultimately be held that way, but I will say when Dale was at the FCC, this argument was part of what held this thing up, right, Dale?
Well, yeah, there's a whole, Bob talking microwave or.
Intermountain microwave?
Yeah, that was my recollection, Intermountain microwave.
That was the FCC decision that interpreted 310D, that in effect the FCC had to overrule its own decision, but a court still hasn't passed on it.
That's why they set up the two different types of leases. So that way they kind of kept the construct of Intermountain microwave alive and had some of the same factors that were mentioned in the case as part of that. So Intermountain microwave was how the FCC did these leasing management agreements that Bob referred to.
Yeah, and I think to Bob's earlier point, they really did, it did actually sort of, you know, there were a lot of things that were going on that were somewhat questionable whether they fell within, you know, all the prongs of Intermountain, but, you know, I think you can go, you can do a lease now with a lot more security than you used to be able to. I mean, we used to always do, we'd always do capacity, you know, because that was the way we could get around not having to worry about, you know, violating Intermountain. It was, we would just, you know, do wholesale deals.
So let me,
It's less unlawful.
less unlawful, so to speak. Let me get to a couple questions, and I want to get the audience involved. So first off, we had a little bit of a teaser. Both Michelle and Bob were talking about the promise of this market or the complications. In the economist's dream scenario, which doesn't happen probably in any of the markets we're talking about today, you have real-time spot markets, right? That's sort of the platonic ideal. And in theory, when you go to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, when you're, you know, trading whatever contracts are being traded or commodities that might be traded, I guess that's the Chicago Board of Trade, you have literally a spot market, which can be for something today, tomorrow, a year from now. How far along the spectrum, so to speak, sorry, pardon the pun, are we in wireless spectrum to get like a spot market?
Well, I don't think we're all that far along. I think there, by the way, you may know, or probably do know, that Enron was in the process of setting something like that up. They had other issues that kind of overtook that. But to me, first off, I think you have to establish there's a demand for the spot market. And I'm not sure how to do that, and I'm not sure that even if I don't know how to do it, whether I've seen it or not. You know, I think that it's likely if there is a demand, it's a demand among companies like Charla's, you know, large companies who have large needs, which is probably a pretty limited market, and I think there's probably other mechanisms they have for addressing those needs. So that's one issue. The second consideration is I think you probably need a lot better information to have a spot market than you have today about spectrum. I mean, I think that's building. I mean, you have databases that are being improved. You're starting to have databases of things like unlicensed, perhaps, you know. Maybe a little better use, but a little better information about, you know, way satellite spectrum is being used than you had before. But, you know, unless you know what you're trading, I don't see how you could have a spot market. And I don't think right now.
It takes too much kicking of the actual tires to cut a deal, so it has to be more one-on-one. It's hard to have that intermediary platform just brokering them in real time.
And it typically takes too much complementary capital to be used to put the resource uses back to the hotel room, why hotel rooms are rented instead of sold.
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I also think one of the things that Coleman mentioned early on is a difficulty, which is that the government regulates this spectrum in a lot of different ways, so it's not really fungible from, you know, even if it's, you know, close by in terms of the frequency, you can't actually use it for the same things. I mean, and one of the things that I always like to do is, you know, show, you know, just how much of the Code of Federal Regulation, which, you know, the FCC's, you know, 47 is about, I'd say, you know, I don't use the books anymore, but I think it's about this big. And what is wireless is probably 3/4 of that. And so if you just think about what that means in terms of all the little slivers of spectrum that are being used for a lot of different purposes, and then you just go and try and set up some sort of exchange, and you have to deal with, well, I've got to get the regulations changed on that in order for it to work. You know, frankly, I just, you know, you're right, it could wind up working in the CMRS spectrum, which is, the commercial mobile spectrum, that you might be able to make something work there. But I think it would be hard until the commission starts to deal with a lot of that underbrush. And that comes up in a lot of when we have conversations about this, that there just is probably a need for the commission to go in and start, just cleaning out rules that prevent, the free flow of spectrum.
And that's one reason why Spectrum Bridge, who tried to make a market out of this, has found less success than they had hoped. I talked to some of their consultants the other day and asked about this, and they said that they don't feel like this market has really worked out and hasn't developed the kind of spot market. Part of it is the radio problem. There are no cognitive radios that are really out there. Not that the technology and the FCC rules wouldn't allow such radios. It's more a demand question now. The radio technology is there, but until you have the demand, it's always a chicken and egg problem.
So to translate for all the non-experts in the room on this,
Yes.
your platonic ideal of a market is the spot market. Your platonic ideal of a radio is one that has, let's call it infinite tunability. So on the spot, it can quickly move to whatever frequency band is available, and it can communicate, that is, transmit and or receive at that band. In the real world, most radios are created with very specific frequency bands in mind, which of course is a huge constraint on your ability to provide service, and thus a brake on the speed at which people might just transact and adopt and throw up systems.
So what Spectrum Bridge has found is that some of the core desirable spectrum in cellular and PCS and other bands that are used for consumer purposes, they want to hang on to their spectrum and don't necessarily want to lease it out, and even though there may be interested lessors. There are plenty of spectrum bands where there are licensees at higher gigahertz frequencies and lower frequencies that want to find lessees, but they're not finding the lessees interested in using it. And also you need to have a radio, because what Spectrum Bridge is really offering is a unfurnished apartment, all fully set up, but you have to bring your own radio, and there may not be a radio for the spectrum that you want to lease at that moment in time.
Let me quickly ask Michelle one question, then get to the audience. We've already adverted to this public safety spectrum, and for those who are not deep in the weeds here, the federal government set up within the 700 megahertz band a block of spectrum that's for public safety, and there is a ambition that that spectrum would be not only used by the public safety agencies, but would be available for commercial use when not being used by public safety. That, of course, sounds like a lease. It is a particular kind of lease which you'd call an interruptible lease, because public safety, whenever they need it, would seek to get it and use it so it could have maximum capacity, but when they weren't using it, they would seek to allow others to use it.
And as I said in a hearing once, it would come, a service on that spectrum would come with the advertising slogan, guaranteed not to work when you need it most.
To put it,
That's the fear.
to put it more generously, you might have a situation where the lessee uses as surplus. It was not their only thing.
Right.
That's only,
And what would be, again, to modulate what Coleman said, you would be breaking the amount of bandwidth that would be available during those times. So you couldn't, for example, send pictures, but you could make a phone call or send emails or texts. So it's not quite so black and white, but obviously interruptible spectrum on both sides of the equation raises a certain level of nervousness. That model obviously is yet to be rolled out. What are your thoughts on how that might work?
We saw a little bit of that when I was working with the Public Safety Spectrum Trust. And what the FCC did, which really helped this process, and this was a lease from the Public Safety Spectrum Trust, the PSST, to early deployment users or lessees in certain markets, about 16 markets around the country, is the FCC came up with a lease model, and that made it much simpler. And of course, the 16 states and cities and other localities fought back and said, oh, we don't like this lease, and the FCC said, tough, this is your lease, use it or forget about it. And so that took care of the transaction cost issue right up front, is having a model. And I think NTIA has set that up as part of this program too for the FirstNet, is that there'll be a model lease, it sounds like, as well as certain conditions that have to be met, and certain lease fees. The lease fees have to be approved by NTIA and then reapproved. That way there's some central control that'll be an oversight of the whole function. And I also think you'll need, and you'll have to have bypass routes, just like anything else. If there's going to be service interruptions, you'll need a place, just like for traffic on the roads, you're going to have bypasses, and cognitive radio may come out and take over here. So you're going to see more radio probably, radios that might allow use of FirstNet spectrum and other spectrum. And there are techniques available where you can bypass and kind of scoot around so you can use it when you can, but if not, then that's what a cognitive radio is all about, that you can defer to other spectrum bands, and that technology is out there if you can't use a particular band. So it could really work. I'm actually optimistic that if set up right, and it looks like the right tools are out there, it might actually work the way the Congress envisioned.
There's still a question, though, about is it more efficient, is more economic value created by separating the access to the spectrum into two different pools, one for public safety and one for commercial users, or is it in creating one network that uses the spectrum and separating capacity from public safety users to other users? And I think that's
So
still,
just to be clear, this is exactly a question, which is depending on whether you want the market internalized, the same operator provides public safety and its own service and simply would shrink its own when public safety needs it and increase its own. That kind of internalizes the lease arrangement into the overall package.
brings it more inside the
Right.
firm.
The other model is no, you have a public safety operator and you keep that totally separate from the spectrum lease provision. And we're not sure which of those two worlds we'll be living in.
Yep.
Yep. Bob, did you want to jump in on that?
Well, I just will say one thing on it. I think public safety obviously has to have some coming to terms with the notion of how do you share. They have the incentive to do it because they will need the revenue to run their network, and that is probably their primary funding mechanism. So from that standpoint, I guess I would share Michelle's optimism. However, 15 minutes before this panel started, I got an article from Andy Siebold, who is a well-known public safety consultant, which was entitled "The Lessons for FirstNet from the Boston Bombing," and what happened with the commercial networks, asking the question, would there have been a cascading effect from that would have taken the FirstNet network off the air? So there's a lot of issues that are still out there. Smart engineers hopefully can work those out. I mean, certainly the economic issues would suggest that they'll find some way to do it.
So the economic issues get captured by the concept of how to think about option value. And you can model that scenario. Unfortunately, it's not only economics, it's also psychology. And it's my network, I want it when I want it, is a psychological point of view that some licensees have, and to the extent that predominates, it would crowd out any leasing. And by the way, that could be a view that could be held by railroads, and some railroads do have their own spectrum licenses, actually. If they rarely use it, they would never want to lease it because, well, those times they want it, they want to make sure they have it. Ideally, we'll get technology and law that will enable the economic gains to trade, but getting over the psychological barriers is part of the challenge.
And the value of markets is it makes clear what the opportunity cost of taking that position is.
That's
so
right.
you're free to keep it, but you should know how much you're giving up.
And for those, again, who haven't quite captured this point, a lot of users of spectrum, particularly governmental users, may have gotten their spectrum license for free. That's true about a lot of these railroads. And so they haven't necessarily internalized the opportunity cost concept, and thus may not be as moved by that point.
Actually, just to clarify, the railroads had to buy spectrum and pay for it.
In this recent positive
case.
The recent one, but there were prior incarnations of railroad licenses that were given out for free.
Yes, the private radio. one.
Yes.
Yeah, the shared spectrum.
So I'd love to get a
Actually,
student.
Phil, can I just add
Please,
to that
yeah.
too? I mean, one of the things too we were talking about earlier is that, you know, I don't know whether it would work with the radio licenses, but if you don't have flexibility of use where you can easily, you know, transfer those rights too, it makes it extremely difficult. And I think, you know, there was a lot of work that was done probably 20, 25 years ago on just this point. And we've started talking about it again, but I think we lose sight of that's actually one of the reasons why, you know, you either use it as what you've got it for, or you give it back to the FCC, and usually, you know, that's not what they want to be doing. So.
All right, first with a typical protocol here, any students who have got questions, and I'm not afraid to call on folks. All right, I see Alex.
Hi, thanks. I'm a first-year student with the Interdisciplinary Telecommunications Program. I had a question about the conversation of arbitrage that we were just having. The deployment schedules for LTE networks have been mostly in major metropolitan areas, though that's obviously not exclusively true. There's an enormous amount of deployment in suburban markets as well. But there's not as much demand for capacity in those places as there are in urban marketplaces, which is why companies deploy things like distributed antenna systems, Wi-Fi offloads. From a perspective of having an enormous amount of demand in a small market, why would a company choose to engage in an arbitrage situation rather than just a normal leasing agreement?
Did you follow the arbitrage?
I'm not sure.
So, Alex, you got to explain what you mean
And
by
actually, just
arbitrage.
so you know, I mean, in a couple of months, we will have built out LTE to 95% of
Yeah.
the population of.
What do you mean? Yeah, what do you mean by you said
Yeah,
arbitrage?
so-
I'm not sure I follow.
Yeah, so dynamic spectrum access via dynamic spectrum arbitrage. So selling the same frequency commodity service for a different price point to a different user on that type of spot market that you were discussing.
Your idealized
Wait.
market.
I see. So if you could be in an idealized market,
Why would you
I'm not sure I'd use the word
let the-
arbitrage.
that may be a
How would you
question.
engage in effective price discrimination, charging different people different prices by how much they needed it? I mean, that has to assume that we get to this idealized marketplace to begin with, and then assume that we can basically figure out who the buyer is and price it differently because we know they are.
Yeah, and why, from a corporation's perspective, if you're trying to create a secondary market, why would you create a secondary market that might have price discrimination, put all that amount of work into it, internalize all those costs, set up that spot market, and then roll that out, as opposed to charging Alex's company a flat rate for service?
Yeah, and since we're not considering that, I actually think that is more a theoretical question.
It is a totally
Coleman.
theoretical question.
Yeah,
so I'll go to the
no, so
economist.
I can't answer it because it's not even, you know.
It's theory of the firm,
Yeah.
boundary of the firm. And I think your point is that most firms in a dense urban market would want to, there's no margin to transact across in real time. There's no need to change the amount you have access to in real time that's useful. And so you would just keep it internal to your network, your firm, sell either capacity or make lumpier, more infrequent trades as needed.
But it is interesting, one of your assumptions seemed to be that the build-out requirements, and this came up earlier, were based on a population model.
Yeah.
And in the 700 megahertz spectrum, the FCC actually moved away from that.
Just the lower.
Just the lower,
Yeah.
Yeah.
not the upper where Verizon is, to
Where
a
we're in
geographic
everything.
model. So you have 35% build-out requirements by geography in the first 4 years, and then 8 years out, you have to hit a much higher percent, I think it's 70%. And if you don't hit it, yeah, which is challenging in some markets to hit 70% where there are no people, that can be tricky.
That is virtually.
Yeah, and it
So
also is
that-
it's on economic areas, which, you know,
Yes, are
aren't,
lar-
there are
they're bigger.
174 of them in the United States, so they're, you know.
So some of you can come back next year because it had been suggested that we may want to follow up with a conversation on this topic about defining the property rights in minerals, spectrum, and water. And one of the issues is build-out requirements, and I think Charla mentioned it, use it or lose it requirements, which is kind of a different flavor.
And that is one of the conditions as well. So
Yes.
this particular band of spectrum, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over the next few years.
Well, and getting back to Coleman, will the FCC actually pull the trigger?
Yes,
Because
and
in
enforce it.
minerals, it's up to the Bureau of Land Management to say you're not actually using the minerals you've got to, license to do. I don't know who does in water law, but this use it or lose it idea is an interesting one.
And actually, the commission has pulled back
They have
licenses
done
where
in
they
the
have
past,
not been
yes.
built out, yeah.
Not under
But-
this
well,
framework.
Not under this framework,
So-
good
so-
point, yeah.
So in the 700 megahertz, didn't they just issue a whole bunch of waivers?
So this is
The temporary
this is the
waivers, yes.
rent-seeking cynical view is
Yes.
they will continue to give waivers forever until they finally change their rules. Charlie's a little more optimistic they'll actually bite the bullet, which could happen. But you've got to create a regime that's more, to use your model, adjudication. I don't care who you are, you don't follow.
And these waivers were for very specific reasons.
But-
You know,
but
this
they
was
did that in
not,
a-
this is not, they didn't waive the, our spectrum build out and the 700C block, but they did for A and B, and they didn't completely across the board.
You guys will know, just.
And they're not waivers,
You'll probably
they're
know better
extensions.
than I, but in the cellular band, right, the FCC did a use it or lose
Yes.
it aspect, and it was based on where your
Yes.
radio footprint actually was, and it was licensed by the cell tower,
Yes.
not by areas. But then, if anybody wanted access, they'd have to go and say, "You're not using it now. We get to own it." And
This
there
is
was
called Pioneers something?
No,
Finder's
it's
preference?
just the
No,
regular.
it's called Finder's preference.
No,
Fill-ins.
no, it's
Fill-ins.
just regular cellular
But
rules.
I don't think it was
Fill-ins.
an unabashed success in the sense that it then created an incentive to go out
Fine.
and try to get the rights to it because you
Some
could,
did.
but not always filling them out. I don't remember how well it worked out.
We'll
but
come
it
back
was
to this next year. Let's, on point, we have another question here in the back.
Hi, I'm Mustafa Naseem. I'm a second-year master's student in Atlas. So my question, I want to go back to Phil's question as to why other companies aren't leasing their unused spectrum from a public policy perspective. So A, you really want that spectrum to be used, but also, as in Coleman suggested, there might not be a very big secondary market because not a lot of rural radio access network deployers exist. What do you do from a public policy perspective when you, A, want the spectrum to be used, but also want rural areas to get a secondary provider, not be under a monopolistic rule? Does the FCC go in with their universal service fund and incentivize rural providers to buy this, lease the spectrum, or do you just let it be and say that last 5% can just live under a monopoly?
So the question is, what tools does the FCC have to better enable spectrum in more remote areas to be used? They are doing use it or lose it, right? So in
Yes.
theory, that should be a motivating tool.
That's right. And part of the problem is you don't have as many people in rural areas, so you don't have the spectrum
return on
crunch. You
investment.
don't need as much spectrum capacity, so you probably don't need as many carriers. Part of the issue is they have less incentive. Let's say you have 2 rural carriers who were given the spectrum for free, and it was cellular spectrum 15 years ago, and they may have little incentive to then go up to upgrade to higher levels of technology, and that strands those rural consumers with lower level technology and less good service.
And the
So-
FCC is starting to experiment with what you said, which is universal service funds.
That's
They've
right.
got this experimental reverse auction
Auction.
for mobile, right? Which
Yep.
would do exactly what,
But your question raises an important point, which is the public policy objective is about getting service to people and maybe at a reasonable price. It's not about the getting spectrum used because we feel bad for the spectrum.
right. Put it a different way, if you have a single network with robust spectrum and that's all you can support, and lots of spectrum's unused, that's okay. The
Yeah.
tragedy is you have no networks using no spectrum. From a public policy standpoint, that's not okay.
Yeah.
There's a question out there,
The other-
is it viable to have 2 rival networks, or are the economies of scale, density, such that it won't happen in those most remote areas?
And if it doesn't, what is the response to regulate the price or to subsidize the users? What is the
Well, I
efficient
think once
public
you're doing the universal system reverse auction, you're getting a pre-commitment on price. Did you want to, someone else want to jump in? Dale wants to jump in.
Oh, just real quickly, there's a couple of things that the government can do. One is encourage infrastructure sharing through various techniques. The other is a lot of this land is owned by the federal government, and I think the White House has already taken some action to try to facilitate access to public lands and things like that so that you can get through the permitting process quicker in tower locations and so forth.
One last question before we bring up our last panel. We'll go to a non-student. Yes, right up here.
Could you compare the situation, this is a great and very detailed discussion, what about in Europe? Obviously, a completely different system.
Very different.
It apparently works. What's the difference?
Fabulous
What
question.
works, what doesn't?
Does anybody know the state of spectrum sharing and, which is different but not unrelated, and spectrum leasing arrangements in Europe, and if they're more robust, sophisticated, why?
So I don't know if I know the global answer, but somewhat anecdotally from my dad who lives in Paris, there's much more robust leasing of capacity of the MVNO model, and that's been very disruptive there. That they've required leasing at a low price. Competitors have come in and undercut the incumbents and created great price competition.
But not necessarily.
But it's not about
getting-
building infrastructure, spending money on
So
infrastructure.
that's just one of the other tools
Well-
that people are using. The other one that's really taken off in Europe apparently is infrastructure sharing, and that's being used a lot as well. And so that's becoming a new model, maybe going back to the US.
Well,
It's much more active
Sprint
here.
had made some noises about trying to do an infrastructure sharing play as part of their build out of 4G. I don't know where that stands exactly. Well, thank you guys. It's been a really great discussion. And now we're going to get to our cleanup, so to speak, or four spot, which is taking these different experiences and integrating them, comparing and contrast them. And I would like to get my fellow moderators up here. I'd also like to get the famous Dale Hatfield up here. And finally, Richard Howitt, who I think is doing double duty. So. All right, so while folks are coming up, I would like to try to put a little bit more context, which is the different markets that we're talking about all have this characteristic of the public seeing a certain amount of specialness in them and a certain resistance to allowing the markets to control them. And so that has raised levels of nervousness for policymakers. Can we trust the markets? At times that nervousness has actually seemed appropriate. So in the energy trading world, all you have to say is Enron to summon that fear. In Spectrum, all you've got to say is the public safety in Boston. And in water, I'm not sure what your parade of horribles is, but Brad can fill in what exactly that is. So the first point is, where are we in overcoming, if you will, the existential fear that these commodities are simply too important to allow the markets to play a role? Brad, since I don't know what the water analogy is, what's the sort of horror story for water markets, and how are we moving to get more comfortable or not with markets in that area?
Well, maybe, I mean, I'm thinking water transfers in general, you know, the Owens Valleys of the world, where literally areas have been totally dried up and economy's gone bankrupt and the environment trashed.
I see. So if you do start transferring water out of an area, you can literally destroy the ecosystem, and literally you've got a horror show in your hands, and people say, why did you let this happen?
And I would argue we're a long way from letting markets work in many places. For example, in Colorado, lots of municipalities have forsworn doing agricultural transfers. City of Aurora says they're never going to do one again, basically, because they got beaten up so badly in the Arkansas River Valley for moving water out of there by the farmers and irrigators down there. So I think we're a long ways away, but I mean, Richard talked about Australia, and I've spent 6 months down there, and I'm enamored with what they've done, despite Richard's issues with some of what they've really tried to go after triple bottom line. They, you know, how do you optimize these three outcomes, social benefits, economic benefits, environmental benefits, and it put forth some, I think, really interesting principles. You know, cities come first in their water system, environment comes second, although you can debate, and they're not even sure which one of those comes first, but it turns out cities use so little water in terms of what do they need to survive, that it doesn't really matter. They have this term, critical human water needs, and that comes first. Environment comes second, and then all other things come third.
Well, but that all other things category is where a lot of the action is, probably.
Oh yeah, no, it's totally where all the action is.
And
although the environment, I mean, they literally spent $3 billion trying to buy up something like 30% of the water in the Murray-Darling system to devote it to the environment, to have what's called a CHU, Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, to hold it and manage it for benefit of the environment.
But you made a very important move there, which in Spectrum, by the way, the UK has done. So I'm going to segue to Dale on this. If you truly leave it to the market, the state is not without any tools, but the state has to, quote unquote, buy up the resource as opposed to regulate it. And that's a pretty fundamental fork in the road. Some would say just regulate the spectrum so public safety has all this access, or the military has all this access. Or another is make them buy it so they internalize its real value.
And let me just add one other complexity to this. They envision this Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder actually being able to trade this water at times when they don't want to need it. So a full market player, not just, this isn't just for the environment, we're going to scheme like everybody else.
And that's what the UK is telling its government with respect to spectrum for the military. So Dale, our cultural environment, I know we hate to think of ourselves as less capitalistic than any other nation on earth, but in spectrum, we are not as free market as the UK is, and in water we're not as free market as Australia. From the cultural standpoint, I mentioned the psychological point of view of I want to fully control it. How do we get past this cultural block, whether it's the military or public safety or a railroad even, where people don't want to allow the market to enter into the conversation?
You know, listening to the whole conference today, one of the things that jumped in, the elephant in the room in spectrum, of course, is the federal government, because the federal government controls so much spectrum. And, you know, if you're going to have a market, how do you move that spectrum over into the market? And I think what you're suggesting is that there's, in my speeches, it's all about incentives, and if anything, there's negative incentives or disincentives, very strong disincentives for the federal government to want to enter into these sorts of agreements and make their spectrum available. How we overcome that, the PCAST report, the president, they talked about spectrum bucks, some dollars that somehow could be transferred to the federal government users, military, that they could then use to buy more equipment and things like that. But the incentives are just terrible the way it's set up now.
And just to pivot off of what Dale said on incentives, there are two types of errors that any actor, government, or marketplace can make: type 1 errors or type 2 errors. I'm going to mix up which one is which, but one of them is the error that you don't do something you should, lease out your spectrum. The other error is do something that you shouldn't, which is not have spectrum available when you need it. And that specter of the type, I think, 2 error, whoever will tell me, prevents people from thinking rationally about type 1 errors. So they make type 1 errors all the time to avoid ever making a type 2 error. From an economic standpoint, that's not rational, but psychologically speaking, or the incentives that a bureaucrat experiences, that's how they go. Now, in electric power, we have a slightly more optimistic case, because we do have tariffs that are interruptible, where you do leave the fear that some people don't have power, which is, you know, like spectrum for public safety, although not necessarily as much, and like water, but maybe not quite as much. It does get to an existential human need, right? You need to have electric power. You take it for granted until you don't have it. Has there been a little bit more progress in the electric power area towards markets getting past the boogeyman, if you will, that, well, I need to keep tight control over this because if I allow market transactions, I lose that control?
So I think there has. I mean, I think the California experience is receding into the past. There are good design lessons that come out of what happened in California when we think about designing other markets. I think FERC is getting better at enforcement and monitoring of markets. We've got experience in the organized wholesale markets, right, that shows that they're fairly well functioning. Texas is doing its own thing, and they're taking a particular approach, and you can argue about that, but they are actually pursuing a path that makes a certain amount of sense. I think that's the story with the wholesale markets, and I think with cheap natural gas lowering electricity prices for virtually everyone, people may not be as concerned about the impacts of a move to markets. I think the idea of an energy imbalance market here in the West shows that there is an openness to potentially thinking about how markets could solve certain types of coordination problems. It doesn't mean you necessarily have to go for a full wholesale power market. I do think there are issues at the retail level with the customers, though, and not so much the industrial customers who are used to interruptible service, as you suggest, but the retail, end user, the residential customers, still may have problems in moving to a kind of real-time pricing environment. I think that probably varies depending on where they are in the country and their experience so far. And there may be, new service providers that emerge that provide a new way of thinking about your relationship to electricity and energy that could change all of that at some point. But you've still got a legacy of cost of service regulation in a lot of states and a public utility regulatory structure that is not going to go away easily.
So William raised a question. I'm going to go to Richard on this. In all these contexts, water, electric power, and spectrum, using it conservatively, I don't mean like ideologically, I just mean with care and restraint, is a possibility, right? You can use water more or less efficiently. You can use power more or less efficiently. You can use spectrum more or less efficiently. So to what extent does markets, as part of the equation, raise opportunities, and I think you adverted to this, with a new type of provider to save on the use of the resource?
Well, I think that's absolutely essential because I have a statement, there's nothing as sincere as a dollar bill. And because you can embrace the concept of conservation, but conservation costs. And until the opportunity cost of water is reflected in some way, it doesn't have to be that you sell it, it just has to, you have to know it's valuable. You have a lack of incentives for conservation. Now I know this lifestyle and ethical concepts of conservation are really important, but it is a universal problem. And looking and listening to one of the interesting things comparing these three resources, water has a problem, but we have an F word problem. F word being federal, of course.
As opposed to fluid.
Yes, foolish. We don't have a FERC. We don't have an FCC. And did you notice that one of the interesting statements was that every one of these has an administration, a regulatory, and of course a law bar section to offset. Water is on a state basis, and so we're subject to the vagaries of the different states. And this gives us tremendous problems when we have an interstate water basin such as Colorado.
So interstate water transfers are, from a legal standpoint, a challenge. But I take it technologically speaking, water can move anywhere.
Sure.
And in Australia, it's moving around a lot.
Sure.
How much, just to compare, by the way, in water and electric power, how much is moving around a lot create like power loss in water or water loss? You know, is it a big factor, or is it actually once you start doing it?
I think it's regionally highly specific. You know, in Australia they have enormous channel losses they try and deal with. In a high gradient stream like the Colorado, especially in the upper basin, you can do transfers with very little loss.
So with electricity, we have to remember, right, we're not moving stuff from point A to point B, we're energizing the entire grid, right? And the grid has to be balanced in real time all the time, and people are drawing off the grid and supplying the grid, and the dispatch, right, is dispatching generation to meet load and keep it balanced in all time. So there are losses across lines for sure, but it's not like I'm moving electrons from a generation source.
You have to build these high capacity lines.
We have to have the infrastructure, and so one of the interesting sort of points of difference here is it sounds to me like in water, we have a lot of infrastructure. I wasn't clear in terms of who owns and operates and controls that. With electricity, we have infrastructure we've turned over in the markets, and this is a precondition for the wholesale markets, operation of the transmission system to an independent system operator. Could you do something like that in water, potentially in California? Do you need to build new infrastructure? Building the new infrastructure in electricity is a big part of the problem if you want to create robust markets. I don't know that it's a problem in spectrum. Yes, it's expensive to build new towers, but you don't have the same kind of infrastructure problem, it seems to me.
I wish we could move spectrum from Wyoming to New York.
Well, William, yeah, you're absolutely right. Actually, we really don't need much more infrastructure in California. We need a little bit more connectivity, some more groundwater recharge. We don't need any more dams. But we do need institutional infrastructure, which would be exactly that, an ISO. And we have some provisional plans, and the first thing to do is we give the federal and the state delivery systems over to an independent system operator, and then other systems could join or not voluntarily. But that would be the first step.
And then they would charge a tariff to transport water
They would
from
charge a tariff, and they would trade capacity,
Yes.
movement capacity, just as any ISO does.
You could argue that a lot of the water infrastructure, however, is aging, and that we really don't have a price structure that supports the maintenance of this, particularly on the municipal level and the retail level, which we haven't really much talked about at all. In fact, these elected boards or appointed boards typically set prices way, way too low. And that's one of the reasons you got a
They
trillion
set
to
prices low, and then they regulate access by saying you can water your lawns on Mondays and Fridays, right? Which, from a market-based perspective, is a ridiculous regime. This is not a market regime; it's a control regime. Let me get to one dimension here that's a little delicate, which is the sense of how you allow trades between different users. When I had the pleasure of briefing Larry Summers on Spectrum, he literally said, "Oh, water markets in California," right? This is Coleman's earlier comment. It's all the same. And Spectrum, it's exactly what Coleman said. It's TV broadcasters as opposed to wireless broadband providers. In water, it's agriculture users and it's urban users. And we have now a law in the US that is setting up a framework to enable, it's a market-based regime. It's not going to be dynamic, but it's going to be a one-time transfer from TV broadcasters to wireless broadband operators of what could be 100 megahertz of prime spectrum, where you're going to see this transition. What would be the counterpart in water of making the sort of deal it sounds like Australia's now kind of bit the bullet on? How do we make this happen? And one of the arguments I've heard, I don't know if this is true, is in California, the agriculture users would never let this happen because the profits that they would make in this transfer would be so much, the public would be appalled, so they stop it from being possible, so they're not shown to be sitting on these rents. So it's a fairly public choice theory explanation. I don't know if it's the true explanation, but the question is, why aren't California agriculture users like TV broadcasters, now being organized by our own Preston Patton, by the way, clamoring for the right to sell?
Because their property rights are still not fully defined, and it's exactly that point, that they feel that if they go prematurely to a cash-out sale,
yes,
they will endanger the whole property rights structure.
Okay, so you think that is the explanation?
Yes, I always remember Joe Sachs was, some of you might know, was commenting that he was really puzzled by the Imperial Valley were busy cranking up their irrigation use. And he suddenly thought, no, wait a minute. No. He said, it's a mercantilist thing. It's exactly like shipping silver and gold into Spain from Latin America, that you actually maximize your asset, even if it crashes the economy in the long run.
Talk about perverse incentives, right?
Yeah. Yes, that's a real problem. And so the first step is property rights, property rights, property rights. We've got to define not just what a use property right is, but what a transferable property right is, which takes into account some of the externalities on the local community. And that's where we have to go.
So can it be done? I mean, Brad, your position is Australia has done it. They've defined property rights. They've been able to be tradable, and they've done it with the triple bottom line. So you think it can be done?
Yeah, all these areas, I mean, they're so highly regionally specific, Phil. California is different than Colorado, different than Utah, different than Arizona. The fact that Australia can do it gives us some idea that, yeah, you can do it, but I'm worried about the exact mechanics in certain areas and the regional specifics of deals. One of the things that's gone on in Australia with these water markets that seem to have worked pretty well is that it turned out their whole system was designed, the most senior rights were at the bottom of the system. And when you're moving water, when you're selling water, typically, and you have the environmental needs down there pulling water as well, it so happens everything kind of nicely aligned to get water out this system. And the water markets, the environmental needs at the bottom of the system and the senior rights at the bottom of the system are actually pulling this water down in a way that seems to work. I don't know that that's always the case wherever you might be.
The other factor about Australia is that the irrigated sector is a relatively small proportion of total agricultural production. And whereas in the west of the US, it's the dominant proportion, and in California, it's everything. And so it's a very different situation. But ultimately, Arizona has made that decision, to downscale its agriculture and develop its urban water supplies.
How did they do it?
Desperation, I think.
Yeah.
So in other words, it's got to hit a crisis point.
It's got to hit a major crisis point where you're looking either at serious reduction in urban growth and economy, or reduction in agricultural economy.
So one of the challenges, and this has been in the spectrum world, TV broadcasters for a long time were synonymous with political power. Doing anything that they didn't support was viewed as dead on arrival. I take it in water, it's viewed like the agriculture users have such political power, they can block any effort at reform. Even if the reform would help them, which happened to broadcasters, it still would be opposed by them because they'd be worried about where it all would cascade.
Well, the last thing, in California, and I keep harping on it, but it's a big place, So you have three people involved in it: the environmentalists, the urban water users, and the ags. The ags have the water. The urbans have the money. The enviros have the votes. But to do anything, you need money, water, and votes. And so you have a perfect blocking coalition.
In spectrum, it was the broadcasters had the spectrum.
Yep.
The wireless broadband operators wanted the spectrum, and the consumers didn't know what the hell was going on.
They just want their TV.
Right, which made it easier.
You still don't.
Yeah.
Right, and still, consumers spectrum, their eyes will glaze over.
But with spectrum, though, just to be clear, right, and I know nothing about this, but there is prime spectrum, as you were saying. So there are
Yes.
certain parts of the spectrum that are more valuable. So the asset itself is already differentiated,
Yes.
correct? It's not fungible in the way that water and electricity can be. I guess you could have water quality that would be higher quality, that would be more demand, that would bring a
I
better
think we
price.
need to be careful. There's a lot of things you can do with higher frequency spectrum by putting in an awful lot more base stations, so it's an economic.
I see.
The higher spectrum tends to
So
be a
when
bit
you
more
say
economic,
prime
yeah.
spectrum, then what do you mean?
It's where I can build that at low cost.
I got it.
Yeah,
Okay.
can penetrate buildings well, goes, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about the differences between the three assets.
If you had to map it out in power, is there anyone who's in the pole position today in terms of getting the beneficial use or access rights, and then there's a shift that markets would allow? I mean, if you had more dynamic markets in electric power, or when you have them, how are we going to see behavior change? And is
So-
there anything between here and there that's likely to block that from happening?
Well, there are lots of things that could block it, but there clearly are people who would see a lot of benefits from more robust wholesale power markets. The independent generators, obviously the merchant generators would be big in favor of this. Some renewables folks see wholesale power markets as more capable of absorbing and integrating more renewable energy onto the grid. Demand response folks like wholesale power markets and are in favor of this. On the other side, of course, the big incumbent IOUs and the regulatory structure around that. Some consumer advocates are skeptical of markets because of some of the problems that we've had. And I think it's fragmented, balkanized across the country, so it really depends.
And I would argue that done correctly in the agricultural sector, you could get significant investment through markets that would allow agriculture to invest in far more efficient systems than they have now. Again,
So this is
decaying.
this is the conservation point.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
because this is Coleman's point, opportunity costs are not priced in. Agriculture users don't know the value of the resource because there's no market, are not using methods that would better conserve the use of water because they've got no incentive to conserve.
But in all of these cases, right, well, at least in electricity, we have dealt with stranded assets before. We know how to deal with that. We've done it plenty of times. We do it all the time, right? It seems like that's paralyzing water. to some
It's
extent.
part of the issue, because you do have these systems, and as soon as you start to take 20 or 30% of the water out of them, they don't operate very well physically.
But there is a problem with conservation in agriculture, and that is that real conservation, true reduction of evapotranspiration, is really hard to do with technical. And the true conservation, unfortunately, happens when evapotranspiration changes, usually by crops not being grown.
So this is a very technical point. I'm see if I can repeat and capture it. The question on the table is, can you, if the farmers have price signals based on markets, conserve their use of water and make more money, whereas today they don't see the price signals and don't conserve water? There's a question about how much is that technically possible. Are there alternative systems for watering crops that could be more conservative? Richard is less bullish on that than Brad. Is that fair?
Oh,
That's fair, yeah.
I acknowledge it's a real issue, but I do.
I personally, believing more in technological change, would say you create the incentives and an opportunity for new technology systems to evolve. Now, what you may be saying is certain crops are just going to demand a lot of water, so the technological changes use different crops.
Yeah, and in nearly every situation, the water that's not used by the crop goes down to groundwater, is a recharge supply, and we've already had that interesting discussion about how much of the return flows comes from agriculture. But we can, in fact, and there are a few studies. I've got one student who did one in Kansas, where improving the irrigation system increased the total net use of water during the year. Because if you could improve,
The opposite effect of what you'd hope for, in other words.
yeah, and it's counterintuitive, and I'll leave it till
All right, so let me put one last point out there, and then we'll get the audience involved. What is an interesting challenge that I think cuts across each of these areas is as you have new opportunities based on economics and technology, developing the institutional arrangements necessary, particularly as arrangements threaten established interests, is really hard. So we've mentioned at least two in water. One is the federal versus the state. Institutional arrangements that would cut across state boundaries is really hard in water. Second, it's really hard to develop arrangements that would threaten agricultural users. In spectrum, I think we're seeing some of these reforms happen, and same in power, but they're not easy. And we worry about some of these F words, the FCC and the FERC, being able to manage a job that they weren't set up to do. Neither the FERC nor the FCC were set up for enabling markets. They were set up to do command and control regulation. That transition raises challenges.
The only footnote I'd add to that is we manage spectrum by two. The NTI and the executive branch has federal, and the FCC handles non-federal and stuff like that, which is an institutional problem trying to go across the two.
All right, I know we got a lot of people in the audience who want to jump in. Let me start with David Reed. We got a mic coming your way, David, so.
It's reflected some in the discussion of the panels earlier, in that those of us coming from the telecommunications bent, we're used to what in the establishment of these markets, some social engineering, I'll call it, right? So in the creation of auctions, we have a pioneer's preference where licenses are given to innovative firms, right, in order to advance innovation in telecommunications sphere. We had in the broadband PCS, we had C-block licenses that went for small businesses, minorities, and designated entities, then that in order to pursue a diversity objective. And so and there's a long history of that, and that's what, in your comment, you guys were touching a little bit on universal service, right? But didn't really get into the core of some of that engineering. Now, it's interesting, in electricity, in the power discussions in the water, I didn't hear the same kind of social objectives emerging in some of the markets as they're appearing. And I'm wondering why. Is the reason because spectrum is declared a public good, right? And therefore it's got the FCC working on it for a long time, and they've got some other objectives that they're trying to achieve. Is that the reason?
Well, go for it.
Well, I was just going to say on electricity, it was just left out of the conversation. I mean, there are all kinds of requirements for lifeline rates, for example, for low-income consumers and others at the state level. There are all kinds of reliability requirements and things like that. So there is clearly a government overlay. I think the difference here to some extent is electricity is not a licensing regime, and spectrum, it seems to me, is a licensing regime. And so with that,
of electricity, on the spirit, brainstorming, you could have, and I think in your energy market, you could say utilities are required to buy 20% of energy from clean resources.
we do that. It's the renewable portfolio standard.
Is that, well, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, so we have at the state level lots of those kinds of environmental mandates being imposed on utilities, and the renewable portfolio standard is a great example of that. And so that complicates the market to some extent, right? So now you've got environmental mandates. So in some ways you're encumbering the asset with additional environmental requirements. What struck me about both spectrum and water is that you've got highly encumbered assets that you're trying to free from all this underbrush somehow. And when you do that, you create rent-seeking opportunities and you create stranded assets. But we can deal with that.
What's intriguing to me about Australia, and Richard, particularly because you're a little more critical, I'd like to hear from you. Brad's suggestion is they didn't encumber water at all. When the government wanted to dedicate water, it had to buy it like everybody else.
Well,
that's been happening in spectrum in UK as well, so it's not outside the spectrum insurance.
Yeah, there are actually two methods going on in Australia. So they did purchase water. They've also got a regulatory scheme in place to deal with some of the environmental issues in water.
So they got both going on at the same time.
They've got both going on at the same time. Everybody loves to talk about the market solution just because it's so interesting and innovative, but they continue to have this regulatory structure over water. Let's not forget about it.
I don't want to be, I don't want to come across as critical of Australia. I love the Australian market. In fact, I have it on my iPhone. But if anyone wants to see it.
There's an app. There's actually an app that lets you look at these.
Small market.
That you let you look at the transactions in Australia.
It's
That's on your
here. We
iPhone.
can have a look later. But they got a bit carried away, and they made a number of problems in which we have to try and avoid. And this whole concept has come up a lot of consumptive use. Mm-hmm. And they sold the whole water right. They sold the diversion right, not the consumptive use. And so, in addition, I think in this country, we should learn from the good things and the bad things that happened in the Australian deregulation system, and be very careful about how we define our transferable rights, because I think transferable rights can't necessarily be just consumptive use rights. You've got to take into account the public good component, going back to the social gains. You may possibly have a positive public good by flowing more water down the river, but you may have a negative one at flowing it at the wrong temperature or the wrong time. And so I think it's very important to distinguish transferable rights, taking net water use and the public good component into account.
So let's have a student jump in before we go to other folks in the audience. John, you want to give it a shot?
A student with no background in any of these topics, so forgive me. But it does seem like most of this conversation is kind of presented because of the technological advances in smart grids, in maybe cognitive radios that are coming down the line. I wonder if there's a complementary advancement in water, which is allowing for these smart markets to develop independently of the regulatory framework that used to be completely necessary. If that makes sense.
So part of what's driving the demands for enabling markets in both spectrum and in electric power is infrastructural improvements that enable more dynamic and adaptable uses. Now in spectrum, it still continues to be, as I think we talked about, 2 to 3 years away. Right? I mean, we've been talking about cognitive radio for a decade now, Dale, and it's looking on the horizon. You know, Dale came back from the FCC in 2001 and said, oh, what's going to change the world is going to be secondary market in the spectrum along with cognitive radios. Yeah. And he's still saying it, but it continues to be 2 or 3 years away. Now, in electric power, we are seeing more smart grid technology enable dynamic uses. That's really starting. Is there an analog in water that allows some more intelligent and dynamic uses?
Well, I mean, Richard earlier talked about remote sensing potentially as being of real interest, and I have heard several economists talk about our ability now to get in the air and actually measure consumptive use using infrared technologies. But I don't think this is, I think it's very different than what you described. What's driving these markets is scarcity in water. I am convinced of that. You know, you have a limited resource, yeah, it's variable in time, but it's really quite limited. I mean,
that's true in spectrum too, by the way.
We can desal our way to a little more, but not at prices that clear market.
Yeah, it's an administrative scarcity. I mean, it's a problem in spectrum. I mean,
and partially in water too.
Yeah.
Just a brief anecdote of how I was outsmarted by a smart market. A number of years ago, a colleague of mine and I decided a research project. We got funded to generate a smart market for the Western Water District. It's a very big total water, 600,000 acres. We did so, and it was a pretty smart market. We took it down, the guys agreed, and they said, all right, we'll use it. Naively, we thought we'd see price and quantity intersecting all over the place and know what the value of water was. We saw quantity, but no price, because the farmers and the water brokers were smarter than us, and they'd read their game theory, and they'd seen Beautiful Mind, and they used, and they still do to this day, use our smart market technology to allocate water around in the trades, and all the prices are done on cell phones from coffee shops or pickup trucks. And so we have quantities, no prices.
And how did they measure the quantities for that? I mean, you were talking earlier about measurement issues and measurement problems.
They're net consumptive use,
yeah.
and they shift net consumptive use around. They have a really efficient market within that district. But will they tell you the price? No.
And Westlands arguably is a political player in California that bats way above its weight. I mean, in terms of controlling what goes on with water and water markets, Westland is kind of off the charts with having political connections and ability to do things that you look at them and you say, no way this should happen, and yet it does.
We got right up here and then right back here.
Hey, well, I don't know who you're pointing to, Phil.
You're the man. Go ahead, Charles.
I think the whole conversation is understated. The real revolution we've already had in agricultural water use. Folks, 25 years, 30 years ago, we were still engaging in flood agriculture. Then we turned to furrow agriculture, then to center pivots, and then better center pivots. We've had a huge change. The big elephant in the room that nobody wants to talk about is national agricultural policy. We've had of course, 100 years ago, we wanted to settle the West. Now we don't want to settle the West. And we've got this system that sucks the water-intensive crops to the southwest and west. And at some point, we better look at the agricultural policy and think about some of this ag moving back to the areas from which it came 75, 100 years ago.
So Charles has a point in the telecom world. I was keeping track. This is like what we call universal service subsidies. This is foreign policy and agricultural subsidies. We are subsidizing some water-intensive crops in the West, whereas a rational regime would say, no, those crops should not be planted in the West. They should only be planted elsewhere. Is that tool part of the solution?
From a far West point of view, it doesn't make much difference because at least two-thirds of our ag revenues come from completely unsubsidized crops.
So the ability to drive change.
Two-thirds on unsubsidized.
What's that?
Water use is not two-thirds on
No. I think what he's saying is the crops in California, the major crops, are not affected by ag subsidies.
The major money crops now, the major water crops are somewhat affected. We got alfalfa affected by the dairy policy. Rice.
Rice, come on.
Well, rice wouldn't change much. You could ditch all the ag subsidies, and it wouldn't change California agriculture much at all. But it would change elsewhere. I mean, it wouldn't change us though.
Would it change Colorado?
It would change Colorado, yeah. It would change Colorado in a significant way. It would change Arkansas. It would change Texas.
Right back here. Yep.
Yeah, I want to sort of follow on that. Generally speaking, do you guys see government being more responsive? And I have a second question. Emotional response would be good here.
Government being more responsive
to these issues generally. Are they getting better at it?
in spectrum, I would say government is getting better. I mean, there's definitely been a trend over the last 20 years that is positive. There was an old joke where Coase talked about using markets and auctions to allocate spectrum. And in 1978, he testified before the Federal Communications Commission, and one of the commissioners said, with all respect, Mr. Coase, Easter Bunny will win the Preakness before we ever use auctions to allocate spectrum. Now all spectrum is required to be allocated by auction. So I think there has been a positive trend in spectrum.
Yeah, I would say so in electricity as well. I mean, I do believe in learning, and I think the government can learn as well. And with California, for example, FERC was pretty new to markets at the time, and they really were very slow in reacting to what was happening in California and to the market manipulation that was going on there. They've really ramped up their capacity and their ability to monitor what's happening in a lot of these markets. They're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I think we've learned a lot about market design, and we've built up our capacity for monitoring these markets and some of the enforcement capacity as well.
So I would suggest in the case of water in the 20th century, if we had a supply problem, we just went and built something new. And that game's now over, and it's pretty well acknowledged to be over. And so people are struggling to figure out what's next. And in the Colorado River, we just did this big basin study that looked at all the supply and demand imbalance and looked at, 200 different options for solving these problems. And very few of them were supply side. The supply side options, for the most part, are stupid. Towing icebergs, pipelines from the Mississippi, other interbasin transfers that will never work politically. And yet many of the things that got talked about were sort of management changes and markets and trying to deal with scarcity in a very different way. So I think there's at least acknowledgement that our old toolbox is totally inadequate to the nature of the problem.
I would say I have a climate change scenario in which we downsize irrigated agriculture in the West. But the interesting thing is that because of the nature of some of the crop demands, you can downsize the water use, the footprint, real conservation, and you can also expand markets into high-value crops and keep the revenues up. And I've given this talk to farmers, and they sort of stand back initially, but they start to think about it. And
just for those who don't know the specifics, high-value crops in California are what crops and which are low value?
What we all like to eat more of when we get more money: fruit, nuts, and vegetables.
Okay, and the low-value crops are?
Low-value crops would be wheat, grazing, irrigated pasture, Sudan grass, corn, and alfalfa depends. Alfalfa is pretty profitable right now.
Okay. One more,
sorry,
next question.
my second.
Yeah, go for it.
Is it worth discussing wastewater recycling? Does that enter into this?
This is a great one. I had this on my list, and I was going to mention hydraulic fracturing. Has not been talked about. It creates, it uses a lot of water, would keep using water.
It actually doesn't use that much water, truth be told. However, all water's scarce right now, and at the margin, everything's of interest. So that's
how do we optimize wastewater? And there's different ways to answer the question. One would be, shouldn't fracking only use wastewater if it could, or should it reuse its wastewater or clean it up? How do you better handle the wastewater problem?
So this is kind of the fundamental problem when you talk about water, is that water's mass, it's never destroyed, all right? We decline or decrease the quality of it as we use it. Some of it gets evapotranspirated out of the system, but much of the water we use, for example, in municipalities, 90% of it comes back and can get reused. And so you have this double counting that goes on, and it's very hard to get to the core of this, both to get people to understand, and in this case, because it's not really free water, it's there, and yeah, we have technology to clean water up, and in some cases it may actually be new water, in some cases not. Somebody else may very well be dependent upon that. This is the return flow issue.
All right, sure, right here.
In 10 or 20 years, when we've got smart grid systems in place for real-time spot market trading with electricity, is this going to flood up the bandwidths on the telecom end?
So the nice intersection is real-time use of smart grid technology involves telecommunications, which could be wireless. In the scheme of things, that would be what we call a low bandwidth application, right? So one thing, this got back to Coleman's point, one of the challenges we have now is metering bandwidth when you've got lots of demand. Real-time video would be like high bandwidth. Smart grid actually is a pretty limited user. And so one of the challenges is making sure to accommodate these different uses with priority. Let me segue that to Dale. How are priority systems to enable use of spectrum likely to evolve? And we talked about the public safety concerns on that. That's obviously core to make sure that your smart grid doesn't break down. And that's one reason why some of the electric utilities say, I want to own my own network for smart grid purposes, even though I'm only going to use a very small fraction because I can't afford for it to break down.
What's the question?
How do you assure the network is continuously available when you've got all these competing users?
Well, here again, I think what you're talking about for the typical telemetry for smart grid sort of stuff is low enough that I think it's not a major consideration. I think that was your answer. The interesting thing, the question I wanted to answer, was that we haven't talked at all in the spectrum area. We have this unlicensed spectrum, and a lot of the smart grid doesn't use licensed spectrum. It uses unlicensed spectrum, which is an entirely different. It's a big commons, and there's advantages, and have been battles between the people who are proponents of licensed for all the sort of marketplace users, and there's other people saying, no, this unlicensed thing where people can just come in and innovate, they don't have any requirements for any government permissions and so forth. And that's being used a lot on the smart grid side.
Let's go to Dan in the back.
Thanks, Bill. Great panel. I just wanted to sort of tease something out that was, well, we've been on the edge of talking about it. It's the S word, sustainability. Efficiency and conservation are really driving, not so much spectrum, but certainly in the electric utility industry, there is, in finding efficiency, multiple power plants worth of opportunity, and that's one aspect. Is there a similar, and this is for the right side of the table, is there a similar upside that's an analog to what the electric utility industry is going through right now in efficiency and conservation that the water world is going to be able to do? And coming back to the F word, are you going to be able to do it without government intervention?
What worries me more than quantity conservation is quality, because some of the, and this goes to the fracking question as well, some of the chemicals that are coming in, I mean, principally right now we've got salt and nitrogen, absolutely nowhere near steady state in any irrigated system that I know. They're accumulating. But also we've got some heavy metals and pesticides accumulating very slowly in the groundwater. And so whilst, yes, we are concerned about sustainability of groundwater, and we need to, obviously to bring it in balance in a planned way, and or totally exploit it as they're doing with the Ogallala, which is okay economically. But the quality of our renewable groundwater, we've really got to be careful about, because it's very slow, very insidious, and the ultimate negative common property.
No, go ahead.
I'm just going to add one thing we haven't talked about here is the pollution problem in spectrum. It's very, very real, and so we have a spectrum quality, and it comes from things like, well, you've noticed if you flip on a light switch, sometimes you'll hear it in your AM pop. Well, that's just an example, a very trivial example. But switching power supplies that we all use in a lot of computers are just tremendous generators of radio energy that pollutes the resource. So we haven't talked about it, but you were talking about a little bit about using imaging, for example, in enforcement. There may be some analogies there of what we're trying to do to try to make sure that we don't lose control of these what we call unintentional emitters that are around that are, in some cases, pretty significantly causing problems with the use of the spectrum resource.
And we literally have that as a topic for a conference next fall, right?
Yes.
So stay tuned for that. And those of you in the water world who want to hear more about it, keep an eye on the website.
And we have a conference on sustainability next winter.
That's right. So all these topics. All right, let's try to do round robin quickly. Start here and then see if we can get the 3 questions we got up the line here. Yep.
We heard a lot of talk about trying to create wholesale power markets, secondary markets in energy transmission. And I think it's been known for a while, talking about smart grids and trying to integrate all the regions and whatnot. And now we've heard today about how the West and the Southeast don't have regional transmission organizations that seem to be kind of adverse to having interstate cooperation. And I think the federal government's realized that a lot of efficiencies, productivity, national security interests can be obtained by having a national grid, a smart grid. Is it the historical nature of the state-based utility regulation and the inefficiencies there and the psychological, I guess, we own it, we control it, as well as the private profit-based utility generators? I mean, what are the disincentives for the national government saying it's far more better use of our money to come in and the federal government build interstate transmission lines, move towards a smart grid? What's preventing that? Is it the private profit-based utilities? Is it the state-based historical control? What are the other inefficiency factors that are preventing national government declaring, under the Commerce Clause, national security interest, global warming interest, ecological conservation, all these federal bases? Why isn't that? What's preventing an interstate smart grid from happening?
So let's just tease this apart for a second. So federal government, and if Congress so chose, could come in and amend the Federal Power Act and allow the federal government to regulate to the full extent of its authority under the Commerce Clause, it seems to me quite clearly could regulate all the way down to the retail level if they wanted to. That'll never happen. It certainly won't happen in our lifetime. I don't think it'll ever happen, but I guess it's a theoretical possibility. We ended up with this bifurcated system. The Federal Power Act basically has this compromise, and the feds do wholesale sales of electricity and interstate transmission, and so we have a western interconnect, and they do all the transmission over there. We have an eastern interconnect, they do all of that. Texas is its own little island, so don't worry about Texas, right? They have one regulator essentially doing both wholesale and retail, which is why it's interesting to some extent. Parts of the country that have developed these tight power pools or developed these tight power pools, the Northeast and other parts of the East Coast, went for the regional transmission organization idea and went for these organized wholesale power markets. I think it's hard to judge the success of those markets to some extent because you're trying to compare it to a counterfactual, but I think most people would probably agree that the PJM market is working reasonably well, and we're learning and designing as we go. Texas is its own story. California made some big design mistakes that are fairly easy to identify in retrospect. There was this effort that we talked about earlier on to take a standard market design based in part on what was happening in Texas and elsewhere and impose it on the entire country through a FERC rulemaking, which would have pushed FERC's authority very far in the wholesale power market area, not retail, but wholesale, right? And that was slapped down very hard by Congress. And I don't see the dynamic changing in Congress to allow that ever to come back. One of the big problems we have in the Federal Power Act, though, is, and this is different from natural gas, right? They're separated by 3 years. Natural Gas Act is 1938. Federal Power Act is 3 years earlier, 1935. The Federal Power Act does not federalize the siting of interstate transmission lines, whereas the Natural Gas Act does allow for, basically give the federal government authority over the siting of interstate pipelines. It's a lot easier to build a pipeline than it is to build transmission. And until we solve that problem, it seems to me, we're going to have a big problem trying to integrate wholesale power markets across the country.
So earlier this afternoon, we were talking about non-reserved, or part of the spectrum that we, I think you can say has a secondary use, or, I'm sorry, could you iterate what I was trying to say?
Sure, secondary markets in spectrum?
No, it was actually when we were talking about the part that the police system or
Public safety,
right? When they don't need it,
right, would allow others to have access to it.
Others can have access.
Yep.
So in electric markets, I've noticed that for transmission, a lot of transmission rights are held firm but not used. So our transmission grid, though it is fully unable to build out further, we are not well utilizing our grid.
Well, this is a point that I'd actually never heard before, that people reserve rights to use transmission capacity and then aren't actually using their reserved rights to use it. And so while we have a shortage of transmission capacity, we've got underutilized transmission lines. Have you heard that before, William?
There are some financial transmission rights and other types of rights in certain markets. This is sort of above my pay grade, though. I would suggest you talk to Dave in the back and maybe Rem, who have thought long and hard about this. But there are ways to try to allocate transmission capacity and create separate markets. This goes to the earlier conversation about lots of other ancillary services developing around some of these wholesale markets, and transmission is potentially one area for that.
Okay, actually, so.
But I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Right, exactly. So in power plants, you can look at something called capacity factor to see how much energy was produced by a plant over the course of a year. So I did the same for transmission, for certain transmission paths that I had access to, and I found that their capacity factor was around 40%.
Right. No, it's a very interesting point, and part of what I think was embedded in it was that it could be used more if people who had rights who weren't using it would trade them. That's a point. You got to talk to Rim more on it. Let me say, as much as more people want to keep going, which is a great sign, I do want to allow us to get to this very next important step. How many people here are students or kind of prospective students in the audience? All right, so you all who are in the community, your job is to go seek them out, engage them, folks like John over there, to help them get deeper into this. This is our 3 really exciting, great areas of study that we have deep interest in here at Colorado Law. And we appreciate you coming out. So what we'll do is adjourn to a reception to allow for some more visiting. I want to thank their panelists here for a great session.
Yeah, it's a really